You may be seated. I just want to spend a couple minutes this morning expanding really on some things that we've already started to kind of unpack together, but I want to do that a little bit more explicitly and at a little bit more length, but as you know, I won't go too long. So as I mentioned in the introduction, this morning's Parshat ki Tezei, the widely accepted count of how many different mitzvot are in it stands at 74. And if you put that in the context of the complete list of 613, that's a whopping 12% of the total, which is a lot for any given Saturday morning. And I think that when we get such a rapid fire barrage of commandments, it's tempting to try and make sense of all of them. Not just as individual commandments, but all of them as a whole. What, if anything, do all of these laws have in common? And are there things that we could learn from the aggregation of 74 different mitzvot that govern our lives? And if you are willing to take up that rhetorical challenge, I wish you the best of luck. I don't think there is any right answer to that question. And the level of difficulty of an exercise such as that one is compounded by the fact that the mitzvot laid out in this portion really do run the gamut in terms of their, what I will say, their perceived relevance and longevity. And frankly, whether we can or whether we even choose to try to make sense of some of them. And I'd like to offer a few illustrative examples, since many of the laws included in this morning's Parsha are among the most famous in the Torah. And I'm going to pull some examples, not just from the triennial section we read this morning, but really from the full reading. One of the, again, most famous commandments that we read this morning is the prohibition on shatnez, which is prohibited mixtures. And the example given in the Torah is a prohibition on wearing a garment that is made of wool and linen together. There is no reason whatsoever given for this prohibition. We, as the reader, are left to guess why this has any importance or added meaning, but we are nonetheless obligated not to mix those materials. We are also commanded to build a fence along our roof lines, lest anyone should fall off and the property owner would incur the guilt. This is the kind of law that we get. It's super practical, it is achievable, and we know exactly why it makes sense. And one more law that I can't help myself but to highlight, even though I already said that I wouldn't speak about it anymore from the Bima, and this is when the military is encamped, the latrines must be dug outside of the camp. The text goes on to explain that we do not do this because of anything like disease control or hygiene, but rather because God is with you in the camp. And as you're preparing for war, you wouldn't want God looking down on the camp and finding anything unseemly and turning away from you. It's an utterly mundane and also fascinating law all at once. A mitzvah regarding hygiene that makes perfect sense, something we should inherently want to follow and incorporate into our lives, but with reasoning given that leaves us scratching our heads a little bit. Which led me to thinking this week about what it means to be commanded a mitzvah that should be common sense, or that really does feel totally obvious. In some ways, it strikes me as problematic, for example, that we need to be told not to keep a poor person's garment as a pledge for a loan when that is all that person has in the world. I can't help but worry about what exactly the Torah assumes about the human condition if these laws seem to imply that we cannot assume basic human decency. They also seem to encourage us to give ourselves a pat on the back for simply reaching the lowest possible bar. There are, in fact, some key phrases in this morning's Parsha that emphasize the importance of setting realistic expectations for humanity, not idealistic ones. When the Torah describes what you do when you see your neighbor's sheep wandering in the street, it gives two very specific instructions in addition to the command to return it. The Torah says, do not ignore it and do not remain indifferent. And before anyone says, well, it's a good thing that besides Mac, most of us no longer have anything to do with farm animals, the Torah says that these standards apply to any lost object. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan points out that civilization arose as soon as the human being began to sense conflict between his own claims as an individual and those of society. We have all been in similar situations regarding a lost object, when we must evaluate the costs and benefits of doing what is right as members of a society and doing what feels best or easiest for us as individuals. And so, while we like to think that of course we would return that lost object, that's a no-brainer, who needs a commandment? Sometimes we do need a stark and simple reminder to just go ahead and do the right thing. Judaism is a force in our lives that helps direct our moral compass, something that motivates us to always listen to the little angel on this shoulder, not the little devil on that one. In that regard, it's worth having it spelled out in the text explicitly. There is comfort in acknowledging that as good as we want to be, we are all, after all, still human and prone to stumbles and missteps. And so, if we do lose the way of that moral compass every once in a while, open up Deuteronomy chapter 22 and get a good, clear reminder to do the right thing. Rabbi Bonnie Koppel, a longtime U.S. Army chaplain, writes that what this morning's Parsha challenges us to do is balance tzedek and rachamim, justice and mercy. Humans are imperfect creatures, and therefore we need to hold ourselves and each other with a good measure of mercy. We also, at the end of the day, need to be held accountable for our actions. We are free-thinking beings with the ability to do as we choose, and so justice needs to be a core part of our ethical and social systems. And to this end, with an eye, as I always have at this time of the year towards the high holidays, there's a midrash that gives a parable about how God created the world. And I think it speaks a lot to how we strive to find this balance in ourselves. The midrash asks, to what can we compare the process of creation, especially the creation of humanity? We can compare God's role to a king who had empty glasses before him. The king said, if I put hot water in these glasses, they will expand and break. And if I put cold water in them, they will contract and shatter. What did the king do? He mixed hot water with cold water and filled the glasses. So too, the Holy One said, if I create the world with the attribute of compassion alone, no one would be concerned with the consequences of their actions. With the attribute of judgment alone, how could the world stand? Rather, behold, I create it with both the attribute of judgment and the attribute of judgment, and hopefully it will stand. That balanced middle path is not easy to find. In fact, it can be maddening. This morning, we read about the importance and virtue of sheltering an escaped slave seeking refuge without any sort of condemnation of the actual institution of slavery. The Torah itself has a hard time giving us the keys to this golden middle path. And so for us, we're not mixing hot and cold water. We're tasked with creating our own balance of justice and mercy, and drawing it from different sources as well. Hopefully, we can trust our own instincts and moral compasses to lead us to make the right decisions. And hopefully, we can also draw on the wisdom of the text, the accrued knowledge and tradition of 3,000 years of history, and the important relationships we've cultivated within our own families and communities to help us create that balance when we can't quite trust ourselves to